Today we're going to work a little bit on Lightroom CC by Adobe. It's a little bit different than Lightroom Classic. It's a much simpler version to use. I just want to show you what the tools are, and I want you to be able to understand what each tool does on a basic level. So we're going to look at some of the pictures that we'll be editing for the yearbook, and we will be trying to at least learn what these tools do. So Lightroom CC is the one that has the rounded edges, not the one that has the square box. So that's Lightroom Classic. Okay, so this is a picture from the session that we just did with the girls volleyball. As you can see, the goal of this is to try and have the background be as white as possible. And there's going to be some issues. We're going to have some issues here. We're trying to clear this up. We're going to have some issues here as well with the cropping that we need to do. And we have to be very careful of the not blowing highlights with this photograph. So let's take a look at what the tools are. So if you go here to the right side, you will see that we have the gauges for moving adjustments. We have here the cropping tool. Over here we'll have a healing brush. We have a regular brush. We have some gradients and some radial gradients, as well as other information to do with overall settings when we apply them to various pictures, or if you want to go to edit in Photoshop. But right now we're going to just look at the basic tools that we have here. So we're going to go here to the adjusting settings, and as you can see, we're going to have our first thing is going to be light. So over here, if you click here, you can have your curves, but it's easier to work with the knobs at this time, or the sliders. So in this case, if you work on the exposure, you know that the exposure will change dramatically. So this is the button you got to be very careful to use when you're sliding. Not too much, not too little, because it can change a picture very, very much. And if you have to really move it, your picture's probably beyond repair. So in this case, I like it to go a little bit lower, just to give more details to that tend to be lost in the highlights. The contrast tool over here, it will do a similar thing with the colors. It will just intensify them, or it will create a little bit more of a washed effect, like brightness will do sometimes in other settings. But here you go. You control how much you want to do in the contrast. I particularly like to have a contrast that's a little bit, high, because I like the colors to pop a bit more. So in this case, I'm just going to leave it there and see what I can do there later on. So with the highlights, same thing. If you go too far down, you begin to see people going in funny colors, which is also you got to be careful about. If you go the other way, then you begin to see blown highlights again. Although some people may look a little bit better, you got to be very careful with this kind of thing. You don't want to be blowing your highlights. So for me, in this particular case, I want to bring it a little bit down, but not too much, just to start. The same thing will be with your shadows. If you bring it down all the way, you begin to lose detail in your blacks. If you go all the way, then you begin to have your blacks look like washed out. Down here, you have two other tools. They work in a similar way, but this is more regarding color as opposed to light. So your whites, you can make your whites be really intense. So as you can see here, we achieved the goal of getting rid of the background completely, but we begin to blow highlights here. So again, we can't use this tool too dramatically, or we will have similar repercussions that we don't want to be experiencing. So it's something to be there. And this will do the same thing for your blacks. They get really intense here where you lose detail, or you can go all the way where it's washed out almost completely. Now, although they seem to be the same thing, they do very different things. So sometimes what we want to do is we want to be able to work with the blacks on one section and the whites in another section, and try to balance them in a way that we can work with. Some people prefer to use this tool. This is the tone curve. They use the curves, and so here you can do something similar to what you do with the sliders, but you have a little bit more of a general control. And some people believe this is a little bit easier. So here you set up a dot, you move it up and down, and then you begin to look for that perfect place where things look the way you want them to look. I personally don't like to use this too much, because sometimes you begin to pay attention to just one detail, and then you forget to pay attention to the detail you actually want in another section of the picture. And so you got to be very careful what you're doing. and make sure that you're always paying attention to all the details and not just the detail you're working on at the time. If you keep going down, you'll get to the colors. Here in colors, of course, we have your white balance, which you can change the temperature to something very cold or go to something totally warm. And again, the extremes of these are extreme. So you want to be moderate in how you use these tools and what you do with them. The tint goes the same way. You gotta be careful with this. It'll change the tint of the skin. So if you go too green, or you go too red, the colors begin to look a little silly. So you want to be able to find that perfect place where your picture looks good. Vibrance and saturation are two other tools that we use for colors. I really like these two. And in my style of editing, I really like to increase the vibrance, which will make things like the reds pop out pretty dramatically and very nicely. And then I like to decrease the saturation, which almost dulls every other color. So in this particular case, the dulling of everything else, but the increasing of the reds makes for this nice, almost creamy look that I think is suitable for the white background that we're working on. So that's one thing. Also, you got the color mixer. In this case here, you can adjust a specific color. I'm going to go and adjust the reds. I could change the hue of that red, make it a little bit more intense, a little bit more purple. Our school colors are more like this kind of red, so we're going to keep it there. You could also increase the saturation of that red if you want to, bring some levels up or more intensity or less intensity. So I like it a little bit saturated. The luminance is almost like the brightness, how much it brights here. Right, not this is almost going burgundy. It's almost dull, but over here it's almost glowing. So you got to find that spot in the middle where you feel that it's doing what you want to do. So for now, we're going to leave it somewhere over here and move on. Down here we got some effects. These effects are where's the photo we were looking at? This one. These effects are interesting. They allow you to do things like clarity, for example. In some other places, this is called detail. So if you go here, it brings out the little black details. It makes things really harsh. But in this particular time, when we're shooting ladies, we don't want these harsh definitions on their faces. So we're going to go to the opposite end, and we go to clarity. And this is where things begin to get a little bit smooth and blurry. We don't want to do it too much, but it's something that we can do. They would appreciate if we do that. And then the next one we have is the haze. The haze will do an interesting thing to the blown highlights. So over here, you see the white becomes like blown completely. But in some cases that's good, but in some cases it's not. We go to the other end, we begin to wash it with like a sheet of fog. But we want it to have a nice balance where the picture looks like the whites having increased, but yet we're not wrecking the complete picture by adding too much. The vignette will do an interesting effect. The rims of the photograph will either brighten up. Sorry, this is not the right one. They will either darken up to create this kind of effect, an exaggerated version, or you can brighten them up to create this other effect, which in this case, this one's more suited to what we're doing, but we don't want to always be depending too much on this tool because it can look very cheesy very fast. So you want to draw the attention of your subject towards the middle. You're adding, towards your subject in the middle. So you use a little vignette just to kind of give that sense that the middle is where we're looking at. And the rest of this is exactly for that, is to control how wide, how big, how tall, how round, and how obvious this vignette is in the end. So this is a tool that you can use. The grain is for special effects. You can make something look really vintage, or something like you took it from a photograph from a magazine or a newspaper of old. You can make it look like you use film. So some people really like to bring the grain up a bit. It gives the photograph a little bit less digital flavor. Sharpening, this is again to make images pop a little bit more. But the sharpening, you got to be careful again. If you use too much of it, then your subject begins to look really over exaggerated, and if the features, the outlines of the features become too much. So play with this one. Find that perfect medium where you think that it enhanced your photograph, but it didn't go and exaggerate everything. Noise reduction, if you use your ISO that was too high, this is a good tool to kind of control a little bit of the noise that you may have that you may not want. It smoothens things up. So it's a good tool to have. And this one will do the same thing with the color that got affected in the same way, and it's a little bit noisy from high ISO use. But if you want to go to a little bit more dramatic thing, we have the geometry. And the geometry in this particular case is not something we can use, but it's something that can dramatically change a photograph. And when you begin to move things like this, the photograph can exaggerate in many different ways. So you don't want to be playing with this too much. But in some cases, it will allow you to straighten the line that you need to straighten. Just give the picture a more flat look, or an angle that's a little bit better. It's something that you want to control and not exaggerate too much. Same thing goes here. Sometimes the photograph's taking a bit off, so you want to be able to just move this slightly, but you don't want to go and change a photograph like this. It will never look good. So try to keep these very minimal use. Same thing will go for distortion, one way or the other. They're interesting tools to have. They're mostly used for architectural photography, but they're here, so we'll just leave them there so that you can fool around with them a bit. Same thing will go for rotation. The aspect changes the photograph like this. All of them have to do with changing how we perceive the photograph, how we move it from side to side, and from top to bottom as well. So these are some of the tools that you have access here in Lightroom that we will use most of the time. The cropping tools are over here. You can do these, and these are of course things you want to be considering when you take your pictures. They help you center your picture, make it a little bit more focused on what you want on your subject. So here we go. This is a little bit better than it was before. So we got rid of this part here that was not very defined. It was a bit loose, but it still we could still cut it out of the picture. So over here we got the healing brush. This is good for sometimes getting rid of a little sit or a little piece of something that ended up on somebody's jersey or somebody's cheek or something like that. But it's not a tool that you want to be using too much. When you use it, you kind of draw from one color and then you apply it to another section, and you got to be very clear, very light on the use of this, because otherwise it begins to look like you spray painted things on top of your images. So again, it's a tool that's very handy for some things, but it's a tool you don't want to be using too much. I'm going to go over these kind of quickly because I don't want you to spend too much time on these yet. Here we go. This is your brush. This is an interesting one because this will allow us to fix an area like this that we need to make it wider, but we don't want to touch anything else in the picture. So in this particular case, we can go increasing the exposure, increase this, and then when we begin to apply this down here, we begin to basically blow all that white out and make it look completely clean and fresh. And then when you do that for this particular photograph, it just kind of continues with that theme that we're looking for of having the really white background. We could do the same thing here, and again, you got to be careful because if these tools go on to your blacks, your blacks will look a little bit washed. So you got to just try to keep them as much as possible where you want in your whites, and just carefully go through the edges. So in this case, we finally got to this point where we can see this is the idea, to have this picture of the girls in a way where it looks like the background was never there, or it was perfectly lit, although we had to move some things. The radiance, these will allow you to do things like put color on top of this, which is not something that everybody wants to do. In this case, we're just going to leave these, and this one we're not going to touch them too much for this particular exercise, but it's something that we will look at later on in the future. So for now, again, just to conclude, what I want you to do is I want you to use the sliders over here, the cropping tools, and then use the brushes, the healing brush and the regular brush as needed to come up and do this with a photograph from this session that I will be giving you. Okay, good luck, and I hope everything goes well. Cheers.